Chapter 5 Warlike Love. Ever since February 23rd, the day when he received from Vienna official acceptance of his proposal of marriage to Marie-Louise, Napoleon had lived in a state of fever. In Vienna, his wife was making ready to join him. She set off. She was on her way. She was approaching Paris. Napoleon must make sure that she got a proper reception. He flung himself into preparations for it. He supervised the arrangement of the apartments reserved for the Empress. He gave orders about the placing of the furniture. He regulated the ceremonial. He tested the safety of staircases up and down which processions would pass. He settled court festivities and popular amusements. He granted amnesties to mark the occasion. He mobilized painters, poets, playwrights, engravers. He hurried everybody. Nobody must waste a moment. He anticipated everything, thought about everything, saw to everything. He might have had 10 minds all working at once. He was enraptured. He could not sleep. Was it all a dream? He had been an impoverished young gentleman whose education at Brienne had been paid for by the king, who owed everything to the king. He was now seated on the very throne of that once all-powerful monarch, and he was about to marry a descendant of the Emperor Charles V. and of Louis XIV. To be sure, he was well aware of his own worth. He was the offspring of fame. His victories took the place of ancestors, and his quarterings of nobility were inscribed upon the standards which he had captured from his enemies. But how far he had traveled in 18 years! How remote was the time when he had blackened the seams of his clothes with ink, in order to conceal his poverty! He had been a junior lieutenant of artillery. Now he was renewing the tradition of the kings of France, like Francis I, Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and Louis XVI. He was marrying a Habsburg. He was becoming the grandson, the son-in-law, the nephew of emperors. This marriage would raise his throne to the level of other thrones, buttress it upon a line of Caesars, anchor it in past centuries, link it with other dynasties, of which it would henceforth form a part. But there was even more than this. Among her ancestors, Marie-Louise could reckon 13 Bourbons, so her son and Napoleon's would have in his veins the blood of the King of France. He would be more or less legitimized. Not for a moment did Napoleon stop to think that for several generations the Bourbons had been degenerating. What matter? The blood of Napoleon would change all that, as it had already changed the face of the world. How could he help loving the girl who brought him such an apotheosis? He never tired of gazing at the portraits of her which he had been able to procure. Dear Marie-Louise! How true to her race she was! Yes, she was indeed a Habsburg, from the crown of her head to the sole of her foot. She had the Habsburg's jutting jaw, their eyes set rather far apart, their slightly flattened nose. Above all, she had their lower lip, that famous Austrian lip, which was, so to speak, the trademark set on its daughters by the most ancient house in Europe. Napoleon gazed with delighted eyes at these stigmata which, in the case of anybody less exalted, would make a fiancé uneasy. Now he must leave Paris and betake himself to Compiègne. Tradition bound him. It was there that Louis XV, at the head of his whole court, had received the Dauphine, Marie Antoinette. Napoleon could do no less for Marie Louise. At Compiègne, his mania for organization took possession of him again. He had cashmere shawls hung in the bathroom, reserved for the Empress. On his way through Diana's gallery, he frowned. What was this he saw? Pictures representing the feats which he had inflicted on the Austrian armies. Away with them at once. If there was no place to put them, let them be burned. Austria was henceforth sacred to him. Ah, how slowly the time passed! Meanwhile, every day Napoleon learnt fresh details about his wife. Not one of them failed to enchant him. How strict, how complete, had been her education. She knew German, English, Spanish, Italian, French, and even Turkish. For you never could tell, could you? She painted tastefully. She sang. She played the piano. She excelled in making corsets, purses, and belle poules. And how innocent she was! In Vienna, she was allowed no male domestic animals. The books she was given had whole passages cut out of them, and her lady-in-waiting never left her day or night. It was a virgin who was on her way to Napoleon. Until now, he had known only women who were married or whose amorous adventures were countless. In Marie Louise's case, he would be the first. The thought touched him. She had everything to learn. When the time came, would he prove a good teacher? Certainly he would, for this virgin possessed a final attraction. She was blonde and fair-complexioned. That was the type Napoleon preferred. And what a dear little heart she had! With emotion, Napoleon read over again a letter which Marie Louise had written some years earlier to her governess, Madame de Colorado, on the occasion of the death of her father, Monsieur de Craneville. My dear Colorado, be comforted. You are always so good to me. Do me the kindness, and be comforted soon. When I grow up, I shall do my best to take the place of your father. Napoleon sought to stay with pictures the hunger which he already had for his Louise. He had received a fresh portrait of her, sent him by Maria Ludovica. He studied it for hours, comparing it with medallions of the Habsburgs which he had brought away from Vienna with him. He questioned everybody who arrived from Vienna. What is she like? One day Colonel Lejeune, who had been present at the marriage ceremony, arrived at Compiègne. In the course of an evening at the theatre, he had made a sketch of the future empress. "Show it to me," cried the emperor. He seized the sheet of paper with shining eyes, darted a glance at it, laid it down again, and clapped his hands. "Ah," he exclaimed, "there is the Austrian lip all right." Meanwhile he could not keep still. Would she never come? He quivered with impatience, and did not know what to do with his time. He went coursing, galloped through the woods for hours, killed hares by the dozen, and came back soaked with sweat, followed by his escort with their tongues lolling out like those of a foundered pack. When he was back at campaign, other anxieties beset him. What figure would he cut in Marie-Louise's eyes? Would she not be disappointed in him? She might imagine that he was a barbarian, a savage. His blood boiled at the idea. Quick, let Leger, Murat's tailor, make him a court suit. Let it sit to his figure, and set him off. Let it be embroidered with gold and spangled with diamonds. He would be no mere husband. He would be a star from head to foot, a star whose function was to dazzle. After finery came fine manners. Napoleon learnt dancing. His stepdaughter Hortense and Stephanie of Baden gave him lessons in the waltz. He revolved till he made himself giddy. No matter, it was for Marie-Louise. She was his one thought. He sent her flowers and game. Almost every morning he wrote to her, and the N with which he signed his letters dilated like the plume of a triumphant cock. At last, in 2 days, or 3 at the most, Marie-Louise would arrive. But now the thought of his first meeting with Marie-Louise worried her husband. He was all nerves. He knew that the first meeting would be decisive for the future of their married life. How could he conquer his wife? As a great general, he knew the value of audacity, the advantage which one can derive from surprise. As at Austerlitz, he said to himself, "I'll trust to the inspiration of the moment." On March 27th, 1810, Napoleon was in his study at Compiègne, with his hands behind his back, and his head down. He walked up and down the room, seated at a small table with his private secretary, Nezelof, a man with a little round head, an infantile mouth, and big ears. He waited, pen in hand. From time to time the emperor stopped and scratched one leg with the heel of the other foot. "Nezelof," he asked, "is everything ready at Soissons?" "Yes, sire, the crimson and gold tents have been erected." The emperor's tone of voice became more imperative. "You are sure nothing is lacking? I want everybody to be at his post. I have regulated the ceremony of the empress's arrival minute by minute. The least delay, the least hitch, may have unfortunate results. The troops are on the spot." "Yes, sire, and the meals are ordered. Monsieur de Bosset has done everything necessary, and my room is ready. Apartments have been reserved for you at the Hotel de la Chancellerie." Napoleon went over to Nezelof and took him by the ear. "You realize, Nezelof, that it would be contrary to the rules of seemliness if I stayed under the same roof as the Empress for the first night. She is not yet altogether my wife. I respect her, Nezelof." "Of course, sire," agreed the secretary, who, with such a master, had learned to say yes more often than no. At this moment a courier was announced. He came in, covered with mud and sweat, his eyes dark-rimmed with fatigue. "Sire," he said, "a letter from Her Imperial Majesty." Napoleon snatched the missive from him, tore it open, and devoured it with his eyes. After a moment or two of silence he shouted, "Constant, ho there, Constant!" His valet hurried into the room. "Go and fetch me Murat." A few moments later, the King of Naples, a tall man with a big head, crowned with frizzled hair, entered the study. "Murat," said Napoleon, "the Empress left Vitry this morning. She will soon be arriving at Soissons. Get ready. We shall start in an hour." His brother-in-law bowed and withdrew. Napoleon turned to his valet. "Constant, order a carriage without livery or arms, and then come and dress me." A little later, stripped to the waist, he cried gaily, "Rub away, Constant, rub away, and don't spare the eau de Cologne. Come on, harder, as though you were rubbing down a donkey." He flung out orders as though he were launching an assault on a city. "My uniform of the riflemen of the guard." When the uniform of green cloth with red trimmings was laid out before him, he reflected and added, "And my grey great-coat, the one I wore at Wagram." Finally, he was ready. Murat was awaiting him, and the carriage drove up. Napoleon slapped his brother-in-law on the back. "She's coming, Murat, she's coming." He turned to Nezelof. "Above all, don't tell anybody I'm not here. Nobody must know where I am." The horses set off at a gallop along the road to Soissons. Suddenly it began to rain. The rain drummed on the hood of the carriage. They passed through Soissons, and the carriage turned into the Vitry road. It went on raining. The downpour smudged the landscape, almost blotting it out. What matter? It was a fine day, nevertheless. Napoleon had so much sunshine in his heart that there was none left for the sky. He hummed to himself, keeping time with his foot. He sucked aniseed candies. He craned his neck to survey the horizon. "Murat," he said to his brother-in-law jovially, "we're both going to meet our wives. Aren't you glad you're going to see Caroline again?" But the King of Naples, who had had no time for lunch, was sulky and pretended to be asleep. At Courcelles, the carriage stopped to change horses. When the Emperor and Murat got out, it was raining harder than ever. The two of them took shelter in the church porch. The wind and the rain lashed their faces. Murat growled glumly. He thought the weather beyond a joke. Suddenly, a courier rounded a bend in the street. Napoleon hastened to hear his news. The Empress would be there in a quarter of an hour. A quarter of an hour, it seemed like a century. Napoleon stood in the middle of the road, heedless of the rain, which soused him like a spaniel. Ah, there was a noise in the distance. A big berlin, drawn by 8 horses, drove into the square. It was she. Napoleon hurried forward and signed to the postilions to stop. A squire who was riding beside the carriage recognized him and lowered the foot-board. "The Emperor!" he cried, thinking he was doing the right thing. Napoleon flung the tactless fellow a black look. Then, shivering, but with shining eyes, he plunged into the carriage. "Louise!" A little cry like that of a bird caught in a trap answered him. Napoleon caught Louise in his arms, pressed her to his heart, and covered her with kisses. "Louise, at last, how glad I am to see you!" His avalanche of caresses left the Empress breathless. Caroline came to her help. She separated husband and wife, and made them sit down opposite one another. For the time being, they said nothing. Napoleon held his wife's hand in both his hands, and gazed at her eagerly. He did not notice that she had a bad figure. He did not realize that her legs were too short, and that her big bosom was out of proportion to the rest of her body. He had no eyes for anything but her pink and white skin, her blue eyes, her pretty, fluffy, fair hair, her nose, and above all her lips. His dream was before him, come true. Napoleon fell in love with her. He was in ecstasy. "How happy I am!" he exclaimed. Marie-Louise, on her side, studied him with surprise. What was this the Corsican about whom they had told her such terrible things? She was almost astonished that he had not horns on his head, canine teeth sticking out of his jaws, and claws in place of nails. No, he was just like any other man, indeed, much better looking than most men. His dark blue eyes were at the moment as soft as velvet. His shapely lips disclosed white teeth. His nose was straight. His chest was deep. His complexion was pale gold. Marie-Louise also admired his small ears, which any woman might envy. "You're not afraid of me any more?" asked Napoleon. Marie-Louise shook her head and smiled at him. She pointed to the medallion which she wore pinned to her bosom. With a strong German accent, she murmured, "Do you know, you're much better looking than your portrait." They were the first words of hers Napoleon had ever heard. They thrilled him. He could scarcely speak. "What tiny hands you have," he said, "and your feet. I've never seen such tiny feet." At this moment, the carriage set off again. Napoleon leant out of the window and shouted to the postilions, "Straight to Compiègne." The order was passed on along the procession. It spread astonishment from carriage to carriage. What about the halt arranged at Soissons? What about the reception which had been ordered? What about the dinner? But so be it. Whip up postilions. The Emperor's will was no matter for argument. The procession went ahead at full speed. In the imperial Berlin, husband and wife continued to improve their acquaintance. Marie-Louise coughed. "Have you caught cold?" asked Napoleon anxiously. "I've got a delicate throat," replied Marie-Louise. "We'll see about that first thing tomorrow. Corvisart shall take care of you. He's a prince among doctors. He could raise the dead." The drive went on. with the rain falling harder than ever. At Soissons, the assembled authorities flung up their hands to heaven as they saw the procession whirl through like the wind. They had to swallow their speeches, roll up their banners, and stuff 50 of themselves with a dinner cooked for 300 people. Napoleon cared little about all this. For the moment, all he was thinking about was making Marie-Louise happy. "I've given orders," he said, "that you are to have sweets and pastries served at every meal, and fancy biscuits for your tea." Marie-Louise clapped her hands. "Oh, I love sweets. You may send your family any presents which you think they would like. Don't stint yourself. You've plenty of money in your purse." Marie-Louise was touched. "You're very kind." And of course, Napoleon went on, "You will have your choice among the best music masters and art masters, not to speak of flowers, dogs, and birds. You have only to say what you want. Can I have some turtle doves? Of course, we'll teach them to coo." Marie-Louise blushed, but she plucked up courage to murmur, "And can I have a nice husband? A husband who would rather die than cease to please you." Marie-Louise thrilled at the caress in Napoleon's deep demonstrative voice. She felt more and more at ease. Outside, night had fallen, and the procession made its way by the light of torches. At 9:30 it reached Compiègne. Napoleon jumped out of the berlin and gave his hand to his empress to help her out. A crowd awaited them. Napoleon made short work of this nuisance. Within 2 minutes he had hurried through family introductions, clipped the wings of choristers, and brushed aside little girls presenting bouquets. Why couldn't they leave him alone with his wife? Amid all this hubbub, Marie-Louise could not see her way very clearly. Nevertheless, as Madame de Montebello led her to her apartments, she said to her, "The Emperor is very charming, very gentle, for such a dreadful warrior. I think I'm going to be very fond of him now I've met him." An order from the master sufficed to improvise a dinner party in Marie-Louise's apartments. The company numbered only 3, the Emperor, the Empress, and Caroline. It was a gay meal. Marie-Louise drank champagne and found it to her liking. When they came to dessert, the Queen of Naples took herself off, and husband and wife were left face to face. Napoleon looked at the clock. Midnight. He reflected that he ought to be on his way to the Hôtel de la Chancellerie, where his bed awaited him. He listened. The trees in the park bent and groaned under the weight of the squalls. Outside there was the rain, there was the wind, there was the cold. Inside here everything was warm, everything was bright, everything was cozy. Napoleon looked at his wife. She had stretched herself out on a couch. There she lay languidly. The light from the chandelier set off the pink and white of her skin. It cast a halo round her fair hair. "Louise," he queried anxiously, "my dear, what did your parents tell you?" Marie-Louise lowered her eyes. In a small voice she murmured, "They told me to be all yours, and to obey you in everything." Napoleon sprang to his feet. He went to the door, opened it, and dismissed everybody. Then he shut the door and locked it. He needed nobody else. Tonight he alone could take care of his wife. He crossed the room towards her. Marie-Louise felt no fear as he approached her. His eyes shone like stars. Napoleon had ceased to be the emperor. All at once he was again Lieutenant Bonaparte, who had initiated fair ladies of Marseilles, Nice, and Toulon, if not into love, at least into republican liberty. He had recovered all his fire, all his passion, all his spirit. The next morning Marie-Louise awakened to find Napoleon's brown head on the pillows beside her. One preliminary conviction imposed itself upon her. The job of being an empress had nothing unpleasant about it. At least it had made a promising start. Napoleon, God be praised, was not like the last Bourbon of France, who married Marie Antoinette at the age of 16 and waited 7 years before tasting the joys of marriage. Marie-Louise had not yet got over her surprise. Could this be the wolf of whom she had been in such fear? This wolf who had eaten her up so delightfully? Meanwhile, Napoleon got up. He was exultant. He felt 10 years younger. He wanted to let everybody share his happiness. He went out of the room and encountered Duroc, the Grand Marshal, his friend and confidant. "Marry an Austrian girl, my dear fellow," he said. To him, "They make the best wives in the world. They are as good as gold, and as innocent and fresh as roses." Napoleon ordered breakfast for two to be served in the Empress's bedroom, and went back to his wife. He found her sitting up in bed, writing. "I'm sending a letter to Papa," she said. "Would you like to read it?" Napoleon took the sheet of paper, and at once these lines leapt to his eyes. "I get on very well with him, and he loves me deeply. For this I am very grateful to him, and I respond to his love with all my heart. I find that he gains greatly on closer acquaintance. He has a charm which is most taking, and is so ardent that it is impossible to resist him." Napoleon smiled. Another announcement of victory, he said to himself. "What a pity that I can't publish it in the Monitor." Chapter 6. Honeymoon. On March 30th, a procession of 400 carriages escorted Napoleon and Marie-Louise to St. Cloud, where their civil marriage was celebrated early in the afternoon of April 1st. The next day, about 10 o'clock, in brilliant sunshine, all the members of the court got back into their carriages to return to Paris, where the religious ceremony was to take place, abandoning for the occasion the carriage drawn by 8 white horses, which were reserved for her. Marie-Louise seated herself beside Napoleon in the coronation coach. Her court dress and train of silver net sparkled with diamonds, and she wore the heavy crown which had already adorned Josephine's brow. Beside her, Napoleon shone no less resplendently. He wore a velvet hat with feathers and diamonds, and he was clad in white satin, trimmed with gold and brilliants at all the seams. Around his neck hung the great necklace of the Legion of Honor. The ceremony took place in the square salon, at the Louvre, transformed into a chapel under Fontaine's supervision. Its decoration, suggested by the painter Isabey, was white taffeta picked out in gold braid. Cardinal Fesch, Grand Chaplain to the court and Napoleon's uncle, officiated at the ceremony. After the singing of hymns and the Te Deum, the procession returned to the Grand Gallery. Then the day's program rolled along with the regularity of a watch spring. There was a review of the guard. Then, at 6 o'clock, there was a banquet in the Grand Auditorium, where the imperial family ate in public. This was followed by a concert, and finally there was a fireworks show, of which little was to be seen because the wind beat down the smoke. Finally, only one formality remained to be accomplished: the blessing of the bridal bed. At last, even that was over. Marie-Louise was married, and she could take off her crown. She was so tired that she could scarcely see. Meanwhile, the populace gave free rein to their delight. They were not admitted to the official festivities, but they were given the wherewithal to fill their bellies. There were pastries and sausages by the thousand, legs of mutton and chickens by the hundred. Fountains of wine flowed for them all day long in the Champs-Élysées, where a fair provided them with such edifying games as greasy poles, breakneck ladders, and slippery slides. Towards evening, in the hope of seeing their master and new mistress, the populace prowled round the Tuileries. All at once a window opened, and a man appeared on the balcony. It was Metternich, who was dining with Reginald de Saint-Jean d'Angely, Barnet, and some others in one of the Council of State rooms. He had a glass of champagne in his hand. He raised it aloft, and in a thundering voice shouted to the rabble, "To the King of Rome." The rabble responded with cheers, "To the King of Rome." Then they took themselves off to gape at Madame Foriso, who was staging a luminous wire-walking act. By this time, indeed, the whole city was illuminated. 36,000 braziers transformed the Tuileries into a bonfire. Everywhere arose dazzling porticos, flaming arcs of triumph. The Champs-Élysées and the Pont de la Concorde crackled with sparks. Over all the public monuments hovered allegories in fire. Peace, uniting husband and wife, shed flames over the Legislative Assembly building, and above Notre Dame blazed a temple of Hymen. The people of Paris could scarcely believe their eyes. They were sorry they had seen so little of the bride to whom they owed all this fairy-like display. Meanwhile, they amused themselves wholeheartedly. They danced, they drank, they sang. Sometimes, as is usual with the populace, their songs lacked reverence. We've sometimes seen such marriages beside the signs water. First you trounce papa, then you trust the daughter. The next day, golden pieces and silver medallions were thrown to the people. In the afternoon, in the throne room, Marie-Louise listened to speeches from the Senate, the Legislative Assembly, and the Council of State. She received homage from ministers, cardinals, generals, prefects, mayors. In all, 1,500 persons were presented to her. Again, she went to bed with a headache. The festivities went on for 3 days. Finally, on April 5th, the court set out for Compiègne. Marie-Louise imagined that there she could have a rest. She did not know her husband. The next 3 weeks were all taken up with hunting, receptions, and bewildering processions of new faces. At length, she and her husband could start on their honeymoon. As a delicate attention, Napoleon had chosen for it precisely one of the provinces which he had wrested from his father-in-law. They were to pay a visit to Belgium. Incidentally, Napoleon was eager to show off his new empress to the people. He was proud of his wife, and he did not mean to let anybody overlook the fact that he had married an archduchess. On April 27th, the imperial couple, followed by a numerous escort, set off for the north in a berlin drawn by 8 horses. They passed through St. Quentin and Cambria. They stopped an hour at Valenciennes for lunch. Finally, they reached Brussels. In every town at which they halted, they had to pass under triumphal arcs, listen to choirs, receive acclamations. They got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. In the afternoon, they had to give audiences and visit monuments and factories. At night, there were plays, fêtes, balls. They went to bed at midnight, only to begin all over again the next day. Even at midnight, Napoleon insisted on helping himself to large slices of honeymoon. Half unconscious, Marie-Louise simply let herself be swept along by this hurricane. Amid the crowds whose one desire was to make her happy, nothing melted her. It never seemed to enter her head that a smile, an attention, a word in the right place, a present tactfully offered, might help Napoleon's cause. In Brussels, since she remained tongue-tied, the emperor had to speak on her behalf. Despite himself, this attitude on the part of Marie-Louise forced Napoleon to remember the wife whom he had repudiated. What a contrast with dear Josephine, always smiling, always gracious, who never failed at any moment to do just the right thing to win all hearts. At length, it was time to return to France. The return journey was made at full speed by way of Ghent, Bruges, and Ostend. Everywhere, the new empress received her ovations with an unsmiling face. Dunkirk, Boulogne, Dieppe, All these places passed by without her deigning to unmend. On June 1st, she and Napoleon arrived at St. Cloud. This time, thought Marie-Louise, I'm going to have a bit of my husband all to myself. A fresh disillusionment awaited her. A program of entertainment was arranged for the whole month. Fêtes alternated with galas, reviews with hunting. But all this fine hubbub did not stop Napoleon being the most devoted, the most attentive of husbands. Husband, indeed, is scarcely the right word. That depressing word usually suggests strictness, routine, boredom. Lover would be a better word. It was a lover that Napoleon wanted to be, and a beloved lover. He had but one object in life. It was to attract his wife, to seduce and win her mind, as he had won her body. This was no hard task. Marie-Louise was docile. Having been brought up strictly, she found conjugal discipline light. She was quite content to lead a quiet life in her inner apartments, with her lady of honor, her lady of the bedchamber, and her attendants, who guarded her as though she were in a harem. She was responsive to the smallest attention, and Napoleon was prodigal in attentions. If Marie-Louise ever imagined she was marrying a veteran, she was soon undeceived. Napoleon had cross-examined himself from the start like this. Might Marie-Louise think him not sufficiently smart? Promptly he ordered well-cut silk suits, fine shoes that set off his shapely feet, on which he prided himself. Might she think him a bit old? On the spot, Napoleon turned back into a boy. For Marie-Louise's benefit, he organized games of prisoner's base, ballooning, and hide-and-seek at Rambouillet and St. Cloud, and in all these games he held his own. He taught her to ride horseback, and he trotted on foot beside her to catch her if she fell. In the evening, when there was no formal entertainment, the Emperor of the French played blind man's buff and hunt the slipper with his wife and their courtiers. Marie-Louise had become the center of Napoleon's world. He was always after her. He interested himself in her dresses and her hats, and went into ecstasies over the drawers which she had made for herself. She brought this fashion with her from Vienna, and it was she who first introduced drawers into French feminine attire. Napoleon urged her to spend money, for he knew that dressmakers and luxury traders were lamenting. Things weren't like this in Josephine's time, they complained. But Marie-Louise had heard how extravagant her predecessor had been, and how angry Napoleon had been about it. So she took good care of her dresses, and discarded few of them. If this was bad for trade, it couldn't be helped. Napoleon loaded her with jewelry. Nor did he stop there. He was all attentions to his new family. Carriages full of presents set off for Vienna. There were presents for Papa, for Maria Ludovica, for Marie Louise's brothers, for her sisters, for her uncles, for her aunts, for her friends. Everything Austrian became dear to Napoleon's heart and sacred in his eyes. He insisted on getting rid even of the memory of the defeats he had administered to Papa Francis, which were commemorated all around him in stone and bronze. Metternich, the Austrian minister, was the object of his special favor. He housed him, fed him, entertained him. He presented him with a mansion, Sèvres porcelain, and Goblin's tapestry. But all this was nothing. Napoleon knew that his wife was completely happy only when he was with her. When they were at the Tuileries, he often left his own simple apartments, and by way of a dark little staircase so narrow that the fat king of Bavaria had become stuck in it, went down to the Empress's apartments. Sometimes he watched her unseen, and was touched by what he saw. Marie Louise might be embroidering or sketching, or she might be performing, to the great delight of her women attendants, the sole parlor trick at which she excelled. By a clever contraction of her jaws, she managed to make one of her ears describe an almost complete circle. When Napoleon entered, the women scattered with little squeaks like those of a brood of mice, on the appearance of a lion. But the lion was soon tamed. Marie Louise took possession of him, played the harp or the piano for him, and showed him her embroidery. Docilely, Napoleon looked, listened, admired. If Marie Louise wanted to sketch him in profile, he sat still as long as was necessary. Did he ever remember that he had refused to pose for David or Ross for 5 minutes? He was at his wife's orders. He waited without impatience when she was late. Hunting tired her, so he gave up hunting. She wanted to play billiards. He played against her, was beaten, and took lessons in order to give her a good game. If she wanted to go for a walk, he was there, prompt to the minute, ready to escort her. Hitherto he had eaten his meals at odd hours, by himself, seated at a round table and using no napkin. He would dig into the dish with his hands and dip his bread in the sauce. Within 10 minutes he had gulped down his fricasse of chicken and drunk his half-bottle of Chambertin. Then, on Corvisart's advice, he had progressed to the extent of taking a quarter of an hour over his meals. Such is the corrupting influence of power, he had complained. Now, to please his wife, he took his meals with her. They were served soup, entree, joint, and sweets. Napoleon took 2 hours over dinner, and as long over supper, and sometimes he had tea with the Empress as well. He could refuse her nothing. Often he deferred his own desires to the wishes she expressed. Once he said to her, "Louise, come and sleep in my room." But the Empress knew that there was a fire in her husband's room all the year round. "No," she replied, with her German accent, "it's too hot." Napoleon resigned himself to going down to his wife's room. There, feeling chilly, he ordered a fire to be lit. The Empress's attendants hastened to light it. "Put it out," cried Marie-Louise. "Put it out." The attendants obeyed, and the Emperor raised no objection. For that matter, he deferred to his wife on more important occasions. Knowing her to be jealous, he visited Josephine and Madame Walewska only in secret. It was no particular credit to him that he showed himself a good husband, for such sacrifices were sweet to him. He loved his wife. She appealed to him physically. He had acquired a taste for her firm young body, which answered so well to his own. He multiplied his overtures with the inspiring object of having an heir as an excellent excuse. He devoted so much conjugal zeal to this end that Corvisart, seeing him haggard and wan, was driven to intervene. "Sire," he said, "beware of excess. You are 42. You are no longer a young man. Besides, you exhaust yourself in ruling the empire." Napoleon smiled. He scarcely thought any more about ruling the empire. Affairs of state bored him. He yawned when he attended the Council of Ministers. The news from Spain was bad, and his presence there was essential. But that would mean going away, leaving Marie-Louise. Napoleon could not bear the thought of tearing himself away from her charming body. At the other end of Europe, Russia, in her turn, seemed to be awakening. To the devil with Russia, the Emperor had nothing in his head but love. But his love for Marie-Louise, instead of being a stimulant, was like too heavy an oil. Little by little, it fouled the wheels of the great machine which Napoleon had constructed, and of which he was the heart and soul. If he stopped, the machine would go on working wheezily for a moment or two, and then it would stop in its turn. Should he not think more about its working? But meanwhile he let himself be held love's prisoner. Marie-Louise was now in a position to measure her power over him. "I'm not afraid of Napoleon any more," she told Schwarzenberg, "but I'm beginning to believe that he's afraid of me." She was happy. She lost no time in thanking her father for having refused to give way to her entreaties, and the tears she had shed at Buda 6 months earlier. Henceforth, like Omphale, she could regard her Hercules as her private property. She would not let him go away from her, or concern himself too long with anything else but her. The slightest prolonged absence of Napoleon from her side produced a scene. One day Napoleon was detained in his study by urgent business. He sent a message to Marie-Louise to apologize for keeping her waiting. She received it, opened it, read it, and collapsed into the arms of Madame de Montebello, with tears streaming down her cheeks. "He won't be here for an hour," she wailed. Alas, it's all over. He's deserted me.